Before diving into this incredible story, remember to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Here, every story has something to say, and you won't want to miss a single one. In a major American city, the Federal Court of Washington D.C.it was animated like a theater of power and prestige. The marble walls, the gilding, and the polished wooden benches lent an air of gravity to each hearing. That day, a simple case of administrative dispute transformed into a scene of racial tension and arrogance. Security guard officer Brian Callahan, a white police officer in his 30s known for his haughty demeanor and disdain for those he considered inferior, patrolled the lobby with an air of superiority. His eyes fell upon Clarice Johnson, a black woman in her 40s, dressed simply but with a natural presence that commanded respect. She was a lawyer, known for her unwavering reputation for rigor and integrity, and was there that day to represent a client in a civil case. Callahan, thinking he was playing his little power game, approached her with a condescending smile. "Madam, you'll have to move," he said in an icy voice. "People like you shouldn't." He didn't finish his sentence, letting condescension fill the air. Clarice, calm but indignant, looked up at him. "Officer Callahan, I would ask you to remain professional. I am here in my capacity as a lawyer." Her voice was soft but firm, each word weighed to impose her moral authority over that of the man. But Callahan, blinded by his arrogance and racial prejudice, ignored the warning and tried to humiliate her publicly. He positioned himself in front of her in an intimidating manner, seeking to ridicule her in front of the other lawyers and court staff. Murmurs began to circulate in the courtroom, some curious, others shocked by the policeman's rudeness. What Callahan didn't know was that Clarice Johnson wasn't just any lawyer. She was the daughter of a respected former federal judge, and her reputation as an incorruptible and determined woman preceded every courtroom she entered. The humiliation he thought he was orchestrating was about to backfire spectacularly. The morning was cool and the sun barely pierced the windows of the federal courthouse in Washington, D.C. Clarice Johnson, dressed in an impeccable black suit and a white blouse, she walked confidently through the doors of the main hall. Her gaze calmly swept the room, analyzing every detail, every movement. She knew these places better than anyone, having grown up in a family where respect for the law and justice were sacred values. Officer Brian Callahan, across the hall, immediately noticed her presence. His cold, calculating eyes fixed on her, and a condescending smile stretched across his lips. To him, Clarice was nothing more than a pretentious black woman, he thought, an ideal target to demonstrate his authority. He strode toward her, his heavy footsteps echoing on the polished marble. "Madam, you will have to move immediately," he said, his voice full of arrogance. "You know how it works here, some people have to wait their turn." Clarice looked up, her calmness contrasting sharply with the policeman's aggression. "Officer Callahan, I am here on official business. Please follow procedure and do not obstruct my passage." But Callahan, confident in his power and the effect his authority could have on her, positioned himself directly in front of her, attempting to physically block her. He believed a few intimidating gestures would be enough to make her back down. Around them, several lawyers and court employees watched the scene with a mixture of surprise and unease. Some whispered among themselves, others remained silent, aware that this kind of confrontation could quickly escalate. Clarice showed no fear. Her penetrating gaze and upright posture commanded a natural authority that Callahan hadn't anticipated. She took a deep breath, then said in a firm but controlled voice, "Officer Callahan, you can try to intimidate me all you want, but here, I respect the law and I'm simply doing my job. Your arrogance won't change anything." Callahan, surprised by her boldness and composure, felt a wave of uncertainty for the first time. He expected her to withdraw, or lower her eyes, but she remained upright, almost defying his authority. This moment was the first sign that his attempt to humiliate her would backfire on him in an unpredictable way. In the shadows, an experienced judge watched the scene intently, noting the tension between the police officer and the lawyer. He knew that the actions of a police officer in the courthouse lobby never went unnoticed and that every behavior could have significant consequences. Clarice took a step aside to get past, but Callahan moved to block her again. The murmur in the room rose slightly. Calmly, Clarice took out her phone and placed it on the desk beside her, she was discreetly recording the scene. A small gesture, but one that would change the dynamic of this confrontation. That day in court, a lesson was about to be played out. The arrogance of a white man towards a determined black woman could turn against him in a spectacular way, and Callahan didn't know it yet. The hearing had just begun in the main courtroom. The benches were filled with lawyers, journalists, and a few curious onlookers drawn by the unusual activity in the hall. Clarice Johnson. She walked gracefully towards the judge's desk, aware that all eyes were on her. She knew that her composure and dignity would be her best allies against Callahan's arrogance. Officer Brian Callahan, sensing that his authority was already being challenged, decided to push his power game further. He followed Clarice into the room, his heavy, deliberate footsteps echoing in the silent space. In a loud voice, he addressed her and the witnesses. "Ms. Johnson, you can't just ignore the rules here. There's a protocol to follow." The judge, a man in his 60s named Judge William Harding, looked up from his papers. He knew Callahan and had already received complaints about his excessive behavior. In a calm but firm voice, he spoke. "Officer Callahan, your role here is to maintain security, not to harass lawyers or obstruct the course of justice. Please cease immediately." Callahan, embarrassed but refusing to back down before what he considered a mere black woman, took a step forward, seeking to assert his dominance. "Your Honor, I am only." He hesitated, surprised by Clarice's cold and authoritative tone when she cut him off. "Your Honor, I respect the law and the rules of the court. I will not allow a police officer to threaten or humiliate me." The murmur in the courtroom grew louder. The other lawyers leaned forward to observe the scene, fascinated by the way Clarice stood up to the policeman's arrogance. Some discreetly took notes, aware that this confrontation could become an example of professional conduct and respect for the law. Callahan felt his anger rising. He couldn't bear the thought of his attempt at public humiliation failing. He turned to Clarice with a mixture of contempt and frustration, trying to find a flaw in her argument. But Clarice remained unshaken, each word carefully chosen to demonstrate her moral and legal authority. At that moment, Clarice made a discreet gesture towards her phone. The camera was already rolling, recording Callahan's every move. This simple act would transform the confrontation into an unexpected turning point. Judge Harding, observing the scene, mentally noted the police officer's attitude. He knew the court would not tolerate abuses of authority, especially when directed against a respected lawyer. For the first time, Callahan felt a pang of doubt. He had thought he could easily humiliate Clarice, but she turned every attempt into proof of her own arrogance. The battle was no longer just in the hall or the courtroom, but in the perception of all who were watching, who truly held the power. This chapter marked the beginning of a series of painful lessons for Agent Callahan. His attempt at domination and humiliation would soon backfire on him in an even more spectacular way. After the hearing, the courthouse lobby was still buzzing with the murmur of lawyers and staff, all curious about what had just happened. Clarice Johnson. She calmly walked away from the room, her phone still discreetly running, capturing every moment of Callahan's arrogance. She knew that every piece of evidence could be used in a future confrontation. Callahan, furious and humiliated by the judge's cold stare and Clarice's indifference to his intimidation, decided to take matters into his own hands. He followed Clarice to the main corridor, believing that another act of public intimidation might make her back down. "Ms. Johnson, I believe you should learn to respect authority here," he snapped, his voice trembling with anger, concealed by a professional tone. Clarice, without even turning around, calmly replied, "Officer Callahan, I have the right to work without intimidation. Your actions are being recorded, and I intend to ensure that this behavior is brought to the attention of the appropriate authorities." At that moment, a group of interns and junior lawyers passing by in the corridor stopped to watch. Some were fascinated by Clarice's quiet courage, while others noted with concern the policeman's overreaction. Callahan, sensing that his intimidation was losing its effect, clenched his fists. But Clarice had a plan. She knew that Callahan's arrogance could be turned against him if she acted strategically and patiently. She finally stopped, turned slowly, and looked the policeman straight in the eye. "Officer Callahan, if you think you can humiliate a black woman in public and get away with it, you are sorely mistaken. Every action you have taken here is being recorded and will be reviewed by your superiors. I advise you to consider the consequences before continuing to act impulsively and racist ally. Callahan, surprised by the self-control and clarity of his message, felt his anger transform into silent frustration. He realized for the first time that every move he made could now be used against him, but he wasn't ready to admit it. Clarice resumed her walk, leaving behind a motionless Callahan, unable to respond verbally. The young lawyers in the corridor murmured among themselves, some mentally noting that they had just witnessed a rare example of courage and dignity in the face of arrogance and racism. This chapter showed that intelligence and patience could neutralize the most brutal arrogance, and that Callahan, despite his initial confidence, was beginning to feel that his attempt at domination was going to backfire on him. A few days later, the main case resumed in the main courtroom. The benches were almost full, some lawyers having come specifically to witness the confrontation between Clarice Johnson and Officer Brian Callahan. The tension was palpable. Everyone wondered if the policeman would dare to try to humiliate her again. Determined to regain some semblance of power, Callahan entered the room with an air of confidence. His plan was simple: discredit Clarice in the eyes of the judge and the public, portraying her as arrogant and difficult. He knew his previous attempts had failed because she had remained calm, but he believed a more calculated move this time might turn the tide. As Clarice presented her argument with clarity and precision, Callahan suddenly stood up and attempted to interrupt her, exaggerating her inappropriate behavior at the last hearing. "Your Honor, I must point out that," he began. Clarice, without raising her voice, looked him straight in the eyes. "Officer Callahan, if you wish to intervene, do so professionally. Any misconduct you commit will be noted and may be punished." Judge Harding frowned and calmly asked, "Officer Callahan, do you have any proof of your accusations?" Caught off guard, Callahan could only mumble a few confused words. Clarice, on the other hand, had anticipated everything. She discreetly activated her recording of the courtroom corridor, showing that Callahan's previous accusations were unfounded and motivated by his arrogance and prejudice. Judge Harding reviewed the recording and frowned. "Mr. Callahan, it seems to me that your previous behavior was more than inappropriate. You attempted to intimidate a lawyer in the performance of her duties, and this is now documented." A murmur rippled through the room. The journalists present immediately took note, understanding that this incident would not just be a simple conflict in court, but clear proof of the police officer's abuse of authority. Callahan felt the color rise to his face. His attempt at discrediting him had failed, and worse, it was now serving to publicly expose his arrogance and racism. He tried to maintain his composure, but every glance around him underscored his humiliation. Clarice calmly resumed her argument, her clear voice resonating in the room. "Your Honor, it is essential that the law be applied fairly, and that no officer think they can humiliate or intimidate a lawyer because of her skin color or status." This chapter showed that arrogance and racism can be turned against those who practice them, especially when a person prepares their response intelligently and with tangible evidence. Callahan had just received an implicit warning: he could no longer act with impunity. After the public humiliation in the courtroom, Officer Brian Callahan had become obsessed with the idea of regaining control and harming Clarice Johnson, but this time, he decided to change his strategy. Rather than trying to humiliate him in court, he wanted to attack his reputation in a more personal and subtle way, outside the courtroom. One evening, as Clarice was leaving her law office, Callahan discreetly followed her. He thought he could intimidate her in the street, making her feel like she was never truly safe, even outside the courthouse walls. Clarice, aware of the police officer's presence thanks to her experience and instinct, showed no sign of panic. She remained calm and walked with a determined stride, her phone always ready to record any incident. Callahan then tried to intercept her near a parking lot, approaching her with a forced smile and a threatening tone. "Ms. Johnson, you should think about how you behave. Some people might interpret your attitude differently." Clarice stopped, looked him straight in the eyes, and replied with icy calm, "Officer Callahan, your threats do not impress me. I know my rights and I will always act within the bounds of the law. Any intimidating behavior on your part will be reported and documented." At that moment, a passerby observed the scene and, intrigued, approached. Clarice discreetly gestured to her phone to activate the recording. She knew that tangible proof of her personal intimidation would be essential to neutralizing any further attacks. Callahan sensed that his attempt at dominance was failing once again. Every word he uttered, every gesture he made, was being recorded and could potentially put him in a difficult position. His frustration erupted into pure anger. But Clarice, unperturbed, continued walking toward her car, leaving the police officer frozen in place, unable to accomplish what he had envisioned as an act of power. That evening, Clarice returned home safely, but with one certainty: every attempt by Callahan to humiliate or intimidate her would be exposed, and his arrogance would eventually backfire. In the shadows, Callahan was beginning to understand, reluctantly, that his personal revenge against Clarice was doomed to failure. And each failure brought him closer to the final confrontation where he would have to face his own humiliation. A few days later, the case resumed in court. Officer Brian Callahan, still furious after his attempted intimidation outside the courtroom, he had devised a new plan. This time, he wanted to use the legal system to trap Clarice Johnson. He hoped to make her appear negligent or disrespectful in the eyes of the judge, believing that this would be enough to tarnish her reputation and restore her lost authority. Clarice, fully aware of her adversary and his intentions, was ready. She had studied every detail of his previous actions, gathered evidence, and knew exactly how Callahan would try to destabilize her. Her composure was her greatest weapon. From the outset of the hearing, Callahan attempted to sow doubt. He questioned Clarice on technical aspects of the case, hoping to confuse her or trip her up in her explanations. "Ms. Johnson, can you confirm that these documents were indeed filed on time?" he asked sharply. Clarice looked up, her expression serene but determined. "Officer Callahan, all documents were filed in accordance with court procedures, and every step is verifiable. If you have any doubts, I invite you to consult the official records." Judge Harding, observing the scene, nodded slightly. He knew Callahan and saw through his attempts at manipulation. He knew that Clarice showed no sign of weakness. Callahan, frustrated by Clarice's resistance to his tactics, tried another approach. He alluded to her past actions to portray her as disrespectful or arrogant. But Clarice had anticipated this move. Calmly, she activated a section of her digital file, revealing recordings of all of Callahan's previous intimidation and abuse, both in the courtroom and in the courthouse corridors. The murmur in the room rose. The journalists took notes, the young lawyers observed carefully, and even some of Callahan's colleagues began to realize the extent of his behavior. Judge Harding intervened firmly. "Officer Callahan, it is clear that your behavior is inappropriate and constitutes an attempt at intimidation. Your actions are documented and are not tolerable in this court." Callahan felt his face burn with shame and anger. Every attempt he had made to trap Clarice had just backfired. He realized, too late, that his arrogance and racism were now exposed for all to see, and that his plan to humiliate her had failed spectacularly. Clarice, for her part, resumed her presentation with the same mastery as always, transforming the attempted trap into a striking example of courage and competence in the face of abuse of authority. This chapter showed that preparation, intelligence, and patience could neutralize the most underhanded maneuvers, and that Callahan was slowly beginning to see his dominance crumble before his eyes. The atmosphere in the courtroom was electric. After several confrontations where Officer Brian Callahan had failed to humiliate Clarice Johnson, he felt his authority wavering. But his pride and arrogance were such that he could not bring himself to accept defeat. He decided to attempt one last act, thinking that a spectacular gesture in the courtroom might finally destabilize her. When Clarice entered for the morning hearing, Callahan stood up abruptly and addressed the judge in a theatrical tone. "Your Honor, I believe that Ms. Johnson is abusing her position to publicly ridicule me." Judge Harding, a man accustomed to the excesses of certain police officers, raised an eyebrow and calmly asked, "Mr. Callahan, can you provide concrete evidence of these accusations?" Clarice, seated at her table, smiled inwardly. She knew that everything Callahan did now would be recorded and documented. She stood up calmly and replied in a composed voice. "Your Honor, every attempt at intimidation or defamation by Officer Callahan has been recorded and documented. His actions are not aimed at maintaining security or justice, but at exercising personal power over me, simply because of the color of my skin." Callahan, furious, tried to interrupt him again, but this time the judge cut him off abruptly. "Officer Callahan, I remind you that your actions are being monitored and that any attempt at humiliation or intimidation will not be tolerated. You are here to ensure security, not to impose your will on a lawyer in the performance of her duties." Clarice then produced further evidence, a written statement signed by several court employees who had witnessed his attempts to humiliate her. The murmurs in the courtroom turned to gasps of surprise. Reporters frantically jotted down notes, realizing that the story of an arrogant officer trying to humiliate a black lawyer was about to cause a sensation. Callahan felt his world crumble. Every plan, every attempt, every threat he had devised to intimidate Clarice was now backfiring. His colleagues and witnesses stared at him in astonishment, and even the jurors understood that his behavior was not only inappropriate, but profoundly unjust. Clarice, impassive, concluded firmly, "Your Honor, justice is not just about applying the law, but about protecting those who are vulnerable to the abuse of power. Today, we have proof that authority can be exercised with dignity or with arrogance. History will judge which of these two paths is the right one." Callahan lowered his eyes, unable to respond, realizing that his attempt at ultimate arrogance had just sealed his moral and professional defeat. This chapter showed that arrogance, when confronted with patience, preparation, and integrity, always ends up backfiring on the one who practices it. Callahan had no way left to regain his honor in this confrontation. A few days after the final court confrontation, the story began to spread through the corridors of justice and beyond. Journalists who had attended the hearing shared detailed accounts of the arrogance of Officer Brian Callahan and the courage of Clarice Johnson. Social media seized upon the news, and soon the police officer's reputation was publicly put to the test. Clarice, for her part, remained focused on her work and did not seek fame. But she knew that exposing the truth was the best way to protect her dignity and that of others who might suffer similar abuse. Her composure and control of events inspired respect and admiration wherever her name was mentioned. Callahan, feeling his career crumble, began to feel the weight of his actions. Every glance from his colleagues, every comment in the press, every whisper in the courtroom reminded him of his failure. He had wanted to humiliate Clarice to feel powerful, but now it was he who was humiliated. In the courthouse corridors, some police officers and lawyers, previously neutral, approached Clarice to congratulate her and offer their support. Callahan, isolated, realized that his behavior had destroyed his credibility and that his arrogance had cost him far more than he had imagined. One evening, sitting alone in his car after his shift, he mentally replayed each confrontation, the recordings, the testimonies, the judge's words. The anger gradually gave way to a bitter feeling of shame and regret. He understood that his attempt at intimidation had not only failed, but had also exposed his prejudices and abuse of power to everyone. Clarice, for her part, continued her work calmly, aware that justice had prevailed. She knew that the example she had just set would be a lesson to all those who thought they could humiliate or intimidate through arrogance and racism. This chapter showed that truth and integrity always prevail in the end, and that the public exposure of abusive behavior often leads to regret and questioning by those who thought they were in control. A few weeks later, Officer Brian Callahan was summoned by the police department leadership and the court to formally answer for his actions. The evidence gathered by Clarice Johnson, recordings, testimonies, and documents, had created an irrefutable case. This time, he could no longer hide behind his arrogance or his uniform. During the meeting, Callahan's superiors began by reiterating the expected standards of conduct within the department. Every word weighed heavily on him. "Officer Callahan, your recent actions towards Ms. Johnson constitute an abuse of authority and unacceptable behavior for a law enforcement officer. You attempted to intimidate and discredit a lawyer, and these actions are documented and verifiable." Callahan, ashamed and nervous, lowered his eyes. He tried to justify himself, but each attempt seemed futile in the face of the overwhelming evidence. In the courtroom, Clarice, though not directly present, knew that the accountability process was underway. She had used her intelligence and preparation to turn every attempt by Callahan into evidence of his own arrogance and prejudice. The sanctions were severe but fair. Callahan was suspended, assigned to administrative duties, and required to undergo mandatory ethics and discrimination training. His career prospects were effectively destroyed. The news spread quickly through the local press and professional networks, and his name became a prime example of what can happen when a police officer abuses their power. This moment was a rude awakening for Callahan. For the first time, he fully understood the impact of his arrogance and racism on his career and personal life. Regret took root deep within him, a bitter mix of shame, frustration, and an awareness of his own responsibility. Clarice, for her part, continued to plead for justice with the same dignity and courage. She knew that her victory was not only personal, but symbolic for all those who suffer injustice and arrogance on a daily basis. This chapter showed that abusive and arrogant behavior always leads to concrete consequences, and that regret, when it comes too late, is often bitter and irreversible. The courtroom was lively that morning, but in a different way. After weeks of confrontations, evidence, and testimony, the case of Clarice Johnson against the abuses and arrogance of Officer Brian Callahan had been definitively examined. The legal community and the public were closely following the case, aware that this episode would become an example of the fight against racism and abuse of power. Callahan, who was present in the room, had become silent and reserved. His former arrogance had given way to a mixture of shame and bitter regret. Every glance around him seemed to underscore his defeat, and he understood that no amount of justification could undo what he had tried to do. Clarice entered the room with the same dignity that had characterized her from the beginning. Her composure and upright posture commanded respect. Eyes turned toward her, not out of curiosity, but out of admiration. Every step of her journey, every confrontation with Callahan, had demonstrated her self-control, patience, and integrity. Judge Harding took the floor, his clear voice echoing in the room. This case demonstrates that power should never be used to humiliate or intimidate others. Ms. Johnson has shown courage, patience, and professionalism in the face of repeated attempts to abuse her authority. Officer Callahan, your actions have been documented and are unacceptable. Callahan lowered his head. For the first time, he fully felt the extent of his arrogance and prejudice. His career and reputation were tarnished, and regret gnawed at him deeply. Clarice, for her part, did not rejoice in revenge, but in justice being served. Her phone, her recordings, and her strategy had transformed Callahan's arrogance and racism into a lesson for all who were watching. Dignity, courage, and preparation always triumph over arrogance and injustice. As she left the courthouse, the morning sunlight illuminated her face. Murmurs of respect and admiration accompanied her passing. She knew that this day marked not only a personal victory, but a symbolic one for all women and all people facing abuse of power and racism. Callahan remained behind, alone, confronted by his bitterness and regret. The lesson was etched in his memory, but he knew he could never erase the weight of his actions. The room emptied, but the story of this confrontation would remain, for a long time, a testament that justice and integrity always triumph over arrogance and discrimination.